Today, let us discuss about menstrual cycle. Or MC. Menstrual cycle. Menstrual cycle in case of females starts when they become adult age or puberty age. When they reach puberty, menstrual cycle will be started. And once it starts, it will be there up to around 50 years. Once they become 50 years old, that menstrual cycle will be stopped. And that is said to be menarche. That is said to be menopause. Menstrual cycle starts at puberty age, is around 14 to 15 years. When they become 14 to 15 years, that is their puberty age where menstrual cycle starts. And it ends when they reach 50 years, where they will enter into menopause. When they become 50 years old, that menstrual cycle will be stopped. This menopause is nothing but a self-sterility in the women when they become 50 years old. There will be no menstrual cycle at all. It means their reproductive phase gets ended when they reach 50 years. That is said to be menopause. Menopause is a self-sterility when the females reach 50 years. There will be no menstrual cycle after 50 years. And that is said to be menopause. And what is the definition for menstrual cycle? Usually, menstrual cycle is very common in primates, like man, ape, monkey, where we do see menstrual cycle in their females. Menstrual cycle is a periodic bleeding for every 28 or 29 days in human females from their puberty to menopause. From their puberty to menopause. That is said to be menstrual cycle. Menstrual cycle is a periodic bleeding for every 28 or 29 days from their adult age to menopause. That is said to be menstrual cycle, because during the duration of that 28 or 29 days, cyclic events are taking place. Cyclic events are taking place. A cyclic events during that menstrual cycle, that is having following steps. It is having phases, 4 phases. Menstrual cycle is having 4 phases. First one is menstrual phase. Second is follicular phase, otherwise said to be proliferative phase. Third one, ovulatory phase. ovulatory phase. Fourth one is secretory phase, or luteal phase. Secretory phase or luteal phase. These are the four phases in menstrual cycle. That first one, menstrual phase, is otherwise said to be menstruation. Menstruation. During the menstrual phase, there is a bleeding. That bleeding will be there for about 3 to 5 days. 3 to 5 days. And during this period, there are around 25 to 65 ml of blood is lost. That menstrual phase, it is a first phase in menstruation, and it is there up to 3 to 5 days. During this menstrual phase, there will be a bleeding and around 25 to 65 ml of blood is lost. And next is follicular phase. And this follicular phase, during this, in the ovary of a female, various types of follicles get developed and matured into Graafian follicle. Various types of follicles will get ready and get matured into Graafian follicle. And its duration is from 5th day to 13th day of menstrual cycle, and is also named as proliferative phase. Why it is said to be proliferative phase? It is said to be proliferative phase because this terminology is used with respect to uterus. During menstrual phase, there is a bleeding. Why that bleeding? That bleeding is due to endometrium, inner lining of uterus, is disintegrated, and blood capillaries present in it are ruptured, broken. That's why bleeding. In the second phase, in case of uterus, it is said to be proliferative phase because already damaged, that endometrium gets repaired and new endometrium is formed layer by layer. Proliferative phase, and is formed layer by layer. This follicular phase, the terminology is used with respect to ovarian changes where follicles are developed. Proliferative phase, the terminology is given with respect to uterus because ruptured endometrium gets repaired and a new endometrial layer is formed layer by layer. And third phase is ovulatory phase. That is 14th day of menstrual cycle. It is on 14th day of menstrual cycle. Usually ovulation takes place on 14th day of menstrual cycle. No doubt there will be a variation. Sometimes 1 or 2 days earlier the ovulation takes place, or else sometimes 2 to 3 days it is delayed. But in healthy females, ovulation takes place on 14th day. What is ovulation? Release of egg or ovum from Graafian follicle. Release of egg or ovum from Graafian follicle. That is on 14th day. And now, last one, secretory phase or luteal phase is from 15th day of menstrual cycle to 28th or 29th day of menstrual cycle. During this, in ovary, there is a secretion of progesterone. Secretion of progesterone, and that secretion of progesterone by corpus luteum. And that maintains normal development of endometrium. That inner lining, it is properly maintained by the progesterone secreted by corpus luteum during this period. Even is also named as luteal phase, because on 14th day ovulation takes place. When ovulation takes place, that empty Graafian follicle becomes corpus luteum, and that corpus luteum gradually becomes corpus albicans and get degenerated. In case if no fertilization within 28th or 29th day, that progesterone secretion is stopped. Once it is stopped, that the endometrium further gets ruptured. It gets ruptured, disintegrated. Once again, bleeding starts. The first day of bleeding, that is the first day for next menstrual cycle. Once bleeding starts, this secretory phase or luteal phase is ended. It means first menstrual cycle is ended, and that starts with the next menstrual cycle, where once again menstrual phase for about 3 to 5 days, and a follicular phase from 5th to 13th, and ovulation takes place on the 14th day, and a secretory phase or luteal phase is from 15th to 28th or 29th day. At the end of 28th or 29th day, once again, if no fertilization, that progesterone secretion is stopped. Once it is stopped, that the endometrium gets disintegrated, blood vessels or capillaries get ruptured or broken and leads to bleeding. In the menstrual cycle, during these 4 phases, our work is to discuss what are the hormonal changes. What are the hormonal changes taking place? With respect to menstrual cycle, the hormones secreted by pituitary plays very important role. One is follicle stimulating hormone, other is luteinizing hormone, FSH and LH. They play very important role. During this menstrual cycle period, their secretion, when it increases, when it becomes normal, when it decreases, that we have to see with respect to graph. In addition to that, how the follicular development in ovary during this menstrual cycle, and the hormonal secretion by the ovary, like estrogen and progesterone. When their secretion increases, when their secretion is very highest peak, and when it will be decreased. That is also we have to see by graph. And finally, during this menstrual cycle, endometrial development. What are the changes in the endometrium of uterus during these 28 or 29 days, we have to study separately. And there would be a question, what is menstrual cycle? What are the phases of menstrual cycle? If we write by defining it, we have to write these 4 phases. It's a typical 2 marks question. Sometimes they would ask, what is menstrual cycle? Explain the hormonal changes during menstrual cycle. For that, we have to draw the graph and explain. Let us see the graph. In this graph, I have made 28 to 29 days chart. And this is divided into, first from up to 4 or 5 days there will be a bleeding, that is menstrual phase. And from 5th to 13th, follicular phase or proliferative phase. On 14th day, the ovulation takes place. And 15th to 28th or 29th day is a secretory phase or luteal phase. That I have made it. And here, in this graph, my target is to show you a pituitary hormonal level. 2 pituitary hormones are involved in menstrual cycle. One is LH. In this 28 or 29 days duration of menstrual cycle, at starting LH secretion is less, gradually increased, but on 14th day it is abruptly increased, rapidly increase and decrease. And at the end it gradually decreases, and on 29th day it will be very less. This graph shows the hormonal level, LH level during menstrual cycle. At starting, it is less, gradually increased during the follicular phase, but at the time of ovulation, that LH rapidly increase and decrease, and it decreases down. At the end, it is more decreased. And another hormone, that is follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. At starting is slightly more secretion than LH, but in follicular phase it is decreased, but is also abruptly increased, rapidly increased at the time of ovulation and decrease, but not as much as LH. But it increases rapidly and decreases down, and is decreases than that LH, and at the end it increases as well. This graph shows. These 2 graphs indicate LH and FSH level during the menstrual cycle as well. And remember, a rapid increase in the secretion of LH and FSH helps for ovulation, means release of egg or ovum on 14th day. Usually, the more increase of the secretion of LH at the mid of menstrual cycle, that LH secretion increases to its maximum, which is said to be LH surge. Due to this LH surge, what is LH surge? At the mid of menstrual cycle, usually on 14th day, there is a secretion of that LH, luteinizing hormone of pituitary, to its maximum rapidly, and that is said to be LH surge. Due to this LH surge, rupturing of Graafian follicle and releasing of ovum or egg, that is said to be ovulation. That is said to be ovulation. There would be a typical question: what is menstrual cycle? Explain pituitary hormonal level or variations during menstrual cycle with the graph. First, you have to define what is menstrual cycle. You have to mention its 4 phases. Then we have to explain by drawing the graph. In that graph, along x-axis, we have to make 28 or 29 days duration, and in y-axis we have to start the secretion of this LH and FSH, and here we can see the variation of secretion of LH and FSH throughout the menstrual cycle, and their rapid increase at mid of menstrual cycle. That is said to be LH surge. Due to LH surge, rupturing, breaking of Graafian follicle and the release of that egg or ovum. Now let us discuss about what are the Orion events during menstrual cycle of duration 28 or 29 days. During these 4 phases, what are the events taking place in the ovary of a female? In the ovary of a female, as the name is indicated, follicular phase, various types of follicles are developed. First one is a primary oocyte, and first follicle developed is primary follicle, and this is secondary follicle, and this is tertiary follicle, and the complete matured one is Graafian follicle. Starting menstrual phase, there will be a bleeding. Then already around 60,000 to 80,000 primary oocytes are there. Around them, one membrana granulosa is formed, primary follicle, that you know about. And secondary follicle means many layered membrana granulosa with theca, and tertiary follicle where many layered membrana granulosa, cavity is appeared named antrum, and theca is distinguished into outer theca externa and inner theca interna. These are all different follicles developed. But in a primary follicle and secondary follicle, there would be a primary oocyte diploid. And in a tertiary follicle, there would be a secondary oocyte. And it gets matured and becomes a matured Graafian follicle. Already we have studied about the structure of this Graafian follicle. It is having a secondary oocyte covered by 3 additional membranes: vitelline membrane, zona pellucida, corona radiata, and many layered membrana granulosa, and a central antrum, and externally covered by theca externa and inner theca interna. And theca interna is having cellular layer and theca externa is having fibrous layer. And this Graafian follicle, already we know, secretes the hormone. It secretes the hormone estrogen. And it induces secondary sexual characters in case of females. Now, on the 14th day, due to LH surge, rupturing of Graafian follicle takes place, and that secondary oocyte or ovum is released. This is said to be ovulation. This is said to be ovulation. And what are the events in the ovary during this second phase? Various types of follicles are developed. But on 14th day, release of that secondary oocyte or ovum takes place. And this empty Graafian follicle in the next luteal phase becomes corpus luteum. Becomes corpus luteum. Empty Graafian follicle. When ovule is, that ovum or secondary oocyte is released, it becomes empty Graafian follicle. This empty Graafian follicle becomes corpus luteum. That is during luteal phase. And this corpus luteum secretes the hormone progesterone. And that progesterone, I have already mentioned, helps for maintenance of endometrium of uterus, properly maintained. And this corpus luteum will be remained for a long time. And secretion of progesterone is going on. Endometrial development is also taking place. If no fertilization within this period, this corpus luteum gradually getting degenerated. The degenerated corpus luteum are named as corpus albicans. Get degenerated, corpus albicans. When they are degenerated, that progesterone secretion is stopped. Once progesterone secretion is stopped, that endometrium gets disintegrated and blood vessels will be broken, bleeding starts. Once bleeding starts, that is the first day of next menstrual cycle. This is with respect to ovarian changes and events taking place during menstrual cycle in the ovary, where primary oocyte become various follicles in follicular phase, like primary follicle, secondary follicle, tertiary follicle, and finally Graafian follicle. On 14th day, release of that ovum or secondary oocyte, that is said to be ovulation, and empty Graafian follicle becomes corpus luteum and continuously secreting progesterone to maintain the endometrium. And if no fertilization takes place, gradually corpus luteum gets degenerated. Those degenerated luteum is a corpus albicans. And once on 28th or 29th day, corpus luteum is totally degenerated and progesterone hormonal secretion is stopped. Hence, there is a disintegration of endometrium. Bleeding starts. Once the bleeding starts, that is the first day for next menstrual cycle. Here also they can ask the question, what is menstrual cycle, and explain with the diagram what are the ovarian events during menstrual cycle. If they ask, you have to draw this diagram with labeling and this chart. That's all. Another question can be asked. What is menstrual cycle? Explain with the graph about ovarian hormonal level. Explain with the graph about ovarian hormonal level. Here the same, a menstrual cycle chart of duration 28 or 29 days with the first menstrual phase, follicular phase or proliferative phase, and ovulation and secretory phase or luteal phase. And there are two hormones which are produced in ovary. Those are two female sex hormones. One is estrogen and other is progesterone. But more particularly, estrogen is produced by Graafian follicle and progesterone is produced by corpus luteum. During this menstrual cycle, what is those hormonal level from first day of menstrual cycle to 28th or 29th day of menstrual cycle? See here that estrogen, its secretion is constant in menstrual phase, even during follicular phase, but abrupt increase in its secretion during ovulation. Around 14th day, just like LH, even FSH, this estrogen secretion is also abruptly increased, rapidly increased. And during luteal phase, it gets secreted, it gets decreased and slightly increased and decreased down. But its secretion, estrogen secretion, is very abundant at the time of ovulation, at the time of 14th day, because at that time Graafian follicle is completely formed and is secreting the estrogen. And this, we have seen it. And another line indicates the secretion level of progesterone hormone. Its secretion during menstrual phase and follicular phase is lesser than estrogen. But it is remained during these first two phases. Even during ovulation, its secretion is not increased much, but is increased during luteal phase. Why? In luteal phase, corpus luteum is formed, and this progesterone is produced by corpus luteum only. That's why we do see a abundant secretion of that progesterone during luteal phase, and at the end gradually decrease. This progesterone secretion is very abundant at the time of luteal phase. And one thing is clear, during ovulation, on 14th day, three hormonal secretion is very much. One is LH, second is FSH, they are pituitary hormones, and another one is estrogen. But less secretory one is progesterone at the time of ovulation. You can, they may make the neat question like odd one out, odd one out. In odd one out, they mention which of the following hormone is odd one out with respect to ovulation. LH, FSH, estrogen, progesterone. In which is odd one out? Progesterone. Why? LH, FSH and estrogen, their secretion is very abundant, maximum during ovulation, but progesterone secretion is less. its secretion is more in luteal phase, because during luteal phase, corpus luteum is formed, is secreting progesterone. And what is menstrual cycle? And explain with the graph ovarian hormonal level. This is the explanation for ovarian hormonal level during the menstrual cycle of duration 28 or 29 days. Yes, last one. Already we have discussed about what is menstrual cycle. Explain the pituitary hormonal levels with the graph. Second one is what is menstrual cycle? Explain with the diagrams the ovarian changes or events. And the third one is what is menstrual cycle, and explain about ovarian hormonal level. And the last one is what is menstrual cycle? The definition for menstrual cycle we have to give, and we have to explain what are the uterine events during the menstrual cycle of duration 28 or 29th days. Already you know about, there are 4 phases as well. The first phase is a menstrual phase. During this, there is a menstruation. Menstruation, bleeding, that is due to the rupturing of this endometrium. It is the innermost layer of uterus. It gets disintegrated and its capillaries are ruptured, broken, and leading to the bleeding for about 3 to 5 days. And during this, around 25 to 65 ml of blood is lost. This is the first event. And the next one is follicular phase or proliferative phase. Here, with respect to endometrium of uterus, it is said to be proliferative phase. Why? This endometrial layer is getting ready, reformed, repaired, and is formed layer by layer. That's why it is said to be proliferative phase. From 5th to 13th day, its development takes place. And on 14th day, ovulation by Graafian follicle. So that this endometrium remains normal for about 28 or 29 days, because it is maintained by the secretion of that progesterone by corpus luteum, and it is maintained until corpus luteum gets degenerated and progesterone hormonal secretion gets stopped. Once it is stopped, and it is stopped only if there is no fertilization, so that gradually this endometrium is getting decreased and finally it gets ruptured. Once it gets ruptured, that is the first day of next menstrual cycle. And this is the diagram indicates how the endometrium gets damaged in the first phase of menstrual phase, and it gets ready during proliferative phase, and is also remained and maintained by progesterone during luteal phase. Once, if no fertilization, it gets damaged at the end. And with this, already I have told, the menstrual cycle starts from puberty age to 50 years old. It means from puberty to menopause. Menopause is when they become 50 years old, a self-sterility, so that menstrual cycle will be stopped. And remember, the first menstrual cycle takes place in females, that is said to be menarche. They may ask one last question. Menarche is the first menstrual cycle in case of females, is named as menarche. And menopause, that is the self-sterility in case of women when they reach 50 years old, where there will be no menstrual cycle. There will be no menstrual cycle. And then, in a case after ovulation, the ovum or secondary oocyte is released. If it gets fertilized in oviduct and that embryo comes to uterus, so that this never gets damaged. That endometrium never gets damaged, because corpus luteum will remain throughout the pregnancy period and continuously secreting progesterone, so that if there is a fertilization and the embryo comes to uterus, this endometrium never gets damaged. Then during pregnancy there will be no menstrual cycle, because the corpus luteum will be remained as it is, secreting progesterone that maintains the endometrium as well. And if there is no fertilization, then only that corpus luteum can remain up to 28th or 29th days. If no fertilization, gradually it degenerates, even progesterone hormonal secretion gets stopped. It is about the menstrual cycle and its phases and changes in ovary, changes in uterus, and hormonal level of pituitary and hormonal level of ovary during menstrual cycle.